In this lesson, we want to encourage you to purpose in your heart. That is, to purpose in your heart, to determine that you are going to live a pure and righteous life so that you can please God. And to study this issue, we want to look at Daniel chapter 1 and notice the example of Daniel and how that he was a man of God determined to live righteously and purely, and how he had a great impact on others when he did this. In Daniel chapter 1, let's begin by reading verses 3 through 8. Daniel 1, verses 3 through 8. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, of the wine of which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Let's notice, first of all, the idea that Daniel had a position that was very beneficial here in the kingdom of Babylon. Remember, Daniel and his friends were captives. That is, Babylon went over and defeated Judah and took people away into captivity. And Daniel and his 3 friends are among those first captives that were taken away. And to be a captive in another land, a slave in another land, can very often be a terrible or hard life, difficult life, not many rights, not many privileges there. But here we see that Daniel, for a captive, for a slave, if you will, had a very good position. He was very well off in being chosen or selected for this training program to go and to serve before the king. So this was very important work. It was influential work because Daniel would have influence with the king, but also with other people in the kingdom just because of his positions, in spite of the fact that he was a captive here. It's a position that would be desired, that people would want to be a part of if, they had a choice. A choice to go and work on a farm versus to go and to work in the palace, to do hard, difficult labor versus doing other types of labor, maybe administrative labor. Well, most people are going to pick in the palace versus out on the farm. And so we see it was something that was desired. There would be with this position internal pressure to compromise. There's pressure to compromise when you have these trappings, if you will, a privileged position, a good position, maybe position that comes with power, with influence. Maybe it comes with certain perks. For us, it might be a job or a promotion that we're looking to get or that we do have. So that we might be tempted to compromise in that. Maybe it is for a young person, captain of a sports team or editor of a school paper or something like that. That position may come with pressures to do things that are not right. And so we see that Daniel is in that kind of position to where he's being pressured to compromise himself. But we see that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself in Daniel 1, verse 8. He made it a decision that he was not going to turn against God. And so we need to draw that inspiration from him to be committed to God, to have an influence with others as Daniel had an influence with his friends, to be an example to the people who are around us. We want to understand that Daniel had a lifelong commitment to this and was very diligent, and we need to do the same. Let's read a little bit further here and notice the fact that Daniel was very diligent to do the right thing. In Daniel 1, verse 9 then, now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed you food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than those young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So Daniel was determined. He purposed in his heart he was not going to eat the king's delicacies. He was not going to drink the wine. And so he requested a special diet. Now, the chief of the eunuchs is concerned about that. Well, if I do that, if I give you a special diet and you're not as strong, you're not as active, you're not as energetic, you're not as able in a physical way to serve as the others are, then I'm going to be in trouble with my king. So Daniel says, okay, I understand you're nervous about that. Let's just do it as a test. Let's do it for 10 days and then see how it turns out. And so the master of the eunuchs agreed to do that. And it says in verse 15, at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. And so he took away those king's delicacies and the wine and put everybody on the same diet as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So it was a success. Daniel took a stand and he stood firm, and that paid off for him and for those who were with him. Now let's think about this, that Daniel had to push hard to do what was right. He had to take a stand for something on which he was convicted. And in 1 Corinthians 16, in verse 13, it says, watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong. Stand fast, be brave, be strong. That's what Daniel did. See, he was being pressured to eat the diet that the king assigned. He was being pressured to eat pagan ways. So he would have violated his covenant relationship to God in doing this. And so he took a stand and said, I'm not going to do that. Give me this other diet. And the master of the eunuchs protested and said, if I do that, then I'm going to be in trouble. So he pushed back. Well, Daniel didn't take that. He pushed back a little more. Well, then let's do this as a test. Let's give it 10 days, see how that turns out. You know, it can be difficult to change what's accepted as normal. It can be difficult to say, I know you do it this way, or I know it's been done this way, but it needs to be done differently, because people resist change. They resist doing something different, especially if you are new to the situation and saying, we need to do something different now. Now, in this case, let's understand with Daniel, and what we're thinking about in applying it to ourselves is, this is a matter of righteousness. This is a matter of truth versus error, of good versus evil, of right versus wrong. So Daniel took a stand and said, I need to do it a different way. And he wasn't going to accept any other answer. And it can be intimidating in situations like this to challenge somebody who is our superior. You know, maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a manager, maybe it's the owner of a business. For young people in school, it may be a teacher or a principal. And you saying, well, I'm not going to do that because it's wrong. And here's what I am willing to do. Instead of giving me this assignment, Let's change it. Give me a different assignment. Instead of asking me to read something that's filled with filth, let me read something that is acceptable. So we look at Daniel and how that he had to push to get what he wanted so that he would be right with God. There are times when we may need to push, if you will, not being ungodly, not being disrespectful, not being those who cause issues or riots or destructive of property, things like that, but people who do take a stand and say, this is the right thing to do. That is acceptable. That is exactly what Daniel did. In Ephesians 3, let's understand another lesson that we don't know what might be possible in taking the right stand. In Ephesians 3, verse 20, says, now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. Daniel was able to go to the person in charge of training the king's servants and the young men who served before him and change the way they did things. Some people would look at that task and say, well, that's an impossible task. There's no way they're ever going to change. But that wasn't Daniel's attitude, because he believed in the Almighty God. And as Ephesians 3, verse 20 says, God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. When we see something and we're confronted with doing right versus doing wrong, and the wrong thing or the wrong way has been established for a long time, we may look at that and think there's no hope. There's no way that's ever going to change. I don't have the power and the ability. Well, you know what? You and I may not have the power and ability within ourselves, but God has the power and the ability. And so we need to trust in Him in these situations. You know, maybe it is we need to change the dates of a business trip because those dates or those travel days maybe keep us from worshiping God when God says we need to worship Him. We need to worship Him on the first day of the week. And maybe it is we need to say, hey, I can't do that. Let me leave a day early or a day later so that I can worship wherever it is that I'm going, or maybe before I go. Maybe it is that young people need to leave a game, a sporting event at halftime because they need to make it to worship services or to a Bible study. And they need to say, here's the priority in my life. It's not the sports. It's not necessarily the schooling. And we need to make a priority judgment in our lives. What is it that's really important to us? Is it going to a recreational event and watching a sporting team play? Or is it serving God, worshiping God, studying His Word, honoring Him, gathering with others to encourage and strengthen them in doing what is right? Maybe it is we need to request a different shift at work or a different location because of the evil influences around us. You know, sometimes in the workplace, we can be surrounded by very wicked people and it affects us. It influences us. And maybe we need to ask for a change so that we can get away from that. So we can take a stand when we think the situation is impossible, but God, in His working, turns it to be something that is possible. And, you know, we need to be willing to accept the consequences, just as Daniel was. If you'll go to Philippians chapter 4, we'll look there in just a second. You know, Daniel, when he went to that chief of the eunuchs, he told him, you know, give us a different diet. And at the end of 10 days, you examine us compared to the other young men, and whatever your decision is, do that. It's acceptable. So he was willing to accept the consequences of taking a stand. You and I need to be willing to accept those consequences. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So So whatever that consequence may be, for young people in school, it may be a bad grade because they refuse to endorse evolution or homosexuality or any number of things that the school systems these days are pushing on the young people. And they take a stand. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to believe that. I'm not going to endorse that. They may get a bad grade. They may be punished in some way. Well, you know what? They need to be willing to accept that, and the parents need to be willing to accept that as well. It's just a consequence of doing what is right. Maybe it is the loss of a job. There have been plenty of people who have refused to compromise. Maybe they refused to lie. Maybe they refused to look the other way when somebody was doing what was wrong. And they've accepted the fact that they would lose their job over that very issue. And that's the right thing to do. And we need to be willing to accept those consequences. Maybe it's loss of pay, loss of income over these things. But we need to be willing to do it, to accept that, because we love the Lord more than we love the things of this world, more than we love the approval of men. We want the approval of God. If your actions lead to great faith and service to God, then any sacrifice and any consequence is worth it, because in the end, we're going to receive that crown of life. So let's be determined that we won't defile ourselves, just as Daniel was determined that he would not defile himself, that we will be pure and free as he was. So one of the things we need to be pure about is our entertainment. So much of the entertainment on television or the radio, on the internet, is immoral. It's impure. It's unrighteous. And in Mark chapter 7, verse 20, Jesus says this, "What comes out of man, that defiles a man, for from within, out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within and defile a man." Be determined in your heart, purpose in your heart, that you're not going to defile yourself with immoral entertainment, with the filthy language, the impure images, the actions of people. You don't want that in your heart. You don't want that in the heart of your family. You want to do what is right. So be determined. No matter the consequence, no matter how people may make fun of you, no matter how people may even get upset with you, be determined. You're not going to defile yourself with filthy entertainment. And be determined that you will not defile yourself with materialism. Remember in 1 Timothy chapter 6, 1 Timothy 6, and beginning in verse 6, the Apostle Paul writes this, "Now godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." You see, we need to resist that temptation to materialism, and it defiles people. It causes them to compromise on what they know is right. And when they do that, they pierce themselves through with many sorrows. They've abandoned the faith, and they've condemned themselves before God. They've made a wreck of their lives, and we can see this in the world all around us. There are many people who go after material things, but are miserable, and their homes are broken homes because they've put material things above their relationship to God first and their relationship to their family second. It's a shame, and it's sad to see this going on in our society. And be determined to not defile yourself with ungodly speech. In James chapter 3, verse 6, it says, "And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature. It is set on fire by hell." The tongue is very powerful. There are times when we use it to hurt others, to cut them to the core. There are times when we use it to convey unrighteous thoughts and feelings, to evoke lust and unrighteousness in others, to stir up anger and hatred, bitterness and resentment. And the Word of God says here, don't do that. Don't allow that to happen. Be careful about your tongue. You and I need to determine that we will not defile ourselves with our tongue. We need to purpose in our heart, just as Daniel purposed in his heart, that we will not allow our tongue to be used for ungodly purposes, but for the praise and honor of glory of God and for the benefit and the blessing of our fellow man. Let's determine not to defile ourselves. Let's determine to live purely and righteously, just as Daniel did, and to help others who are around us to live purely and righteously. So we encourage you, as you reflect on your life, as you recognize that there are situations, there are circumstances where you're pressured to do what is wrong, determine now, right now, purpose in your heart today that you will not defile yourself, but that you will honor your Father, your Creator, who is in heaven.